January 1918, nearly 3.5 years of war. On the Western Front, the British had suffered 2 million casualties, dead, wounded, and taken prisoner. The French, 3 million. The French army was only just recovering from the mutinies of spring 1917. The British army was desperately tired. And all of the fighting had been over just a few miles of French and Belgian mud. The British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, believing that his generals had wasted lives at Passchendaele in late 1917, refused to send further reinforcements. At the front and at home, New Year's Day 1918 was bleak.
When is this awful nightmare going to end? The country is getting tired out. People no longer talk of war. They are saturated with it. When are we again to lead our proper lives? Shall we ever do so again?
But for Germany, New Year brought the chance to win the war.
The German army were at last in a position to launch one final major offensive. The Russians had sued for peace and were no longer in the war, which enabled the Germans to release thousands of men to come back across to the Western Front, ready for their big offensive.
The German commander on the Western Front, General Erich von Ludendorff, prepared for battle.
The attack in the West would be one of the most difficult operations in history, I was perfectly sure. And I did not hide the fact. The German nation too would have to give all it had.
On March the 21st, 1918, the German army attacked along a 64-mile front. It became known as the Ludendorff Offensive and was the greatest attack yet seen in modern industrialized warfare. 6,500 guns and 3,500 trench mortars fired almost simultaneously along the front. Winston Churchill, by now back in government as Minister for Munitions, was visiting army headquarters in France.
Exactly as a pianist runs his hands across the keyboard from treble to bass, there rose in less than a minute the most tremendous cannonade I have ever heard.
After the artillery bombardment, German stormtroopers leapt into action.
The great moment had come. The turmoil of our feelings was called forth by rage, alcohol, and the thirst for blood as we stepped out heavily, yet irresistibly, for the enemy's lines.
A heavy long-range machine gun fire was opened on us. The leading skirmishers, pressing forward like hounds on a hot scent, were very bold.
March the 21st was turning into one of the most dramatic days of the war. German soldiers were stunned by what seemed a huge success.
What we had not dared to hope came true. The enemy artillery was silenced with one gigantic blow. We got out on top and looked with wonder at the wall of fire towering above the English lines, and the swaying, blood-red clouds that hung above it.
We were bombarded with everything the Germans had got. At daybreak we could see the Germans advancing down the valley. We sent back runners to battalion headquarters for instructions. The first 2 runners were either killed or taken prisoner. The 3rd runner came back to tell us that the Germans were cooking breakfast in our battalion headquarters kitchen.
In a fortnight, the German army advanced 20 miles over a 50-mile front, a massive capture of territory compared with the stalemate of the previous 3 years.
The battle was over by the 4th of April. It was a brilliant feat and will ever be so regarded in history. What the English and French had not succeeded in doing, we had accomplished, and that in the 4th year of war.
We are passing through the most critical time we have yet experienced. This Han is a wonderful fighter and has a wonderful organization behind him.
But in fact, the Germans had failed to inflict a decisive defeat, and the British commander, Sir Douglas Haig, issued a rallying cry to his soldiers.
Many amongst us are now tired. To those I would say that victory belongs to the side that holds out the longest. There is no course open to us but to fight it out. Every position must be held to the last man. There must be no retirement. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, we must fight on to the end.
We have seen real war in earnest now. It has been a terrible time, but we remain unbeaten, though exhausted. And the men are extraordinarily cheerful. It is heartbreaking to think of the fine fellows who have gone under.
We never knew from one minute to the next when the Dark Angel would come along with a ticket for us. I mean, the shell bursts above you, shrapnel all the way round. A wound from shrapnel was far worse than a bullet wound. A shrapnel, if it hit you properly, would tear you to pieces.
For the Allies, it was the most critical moment of the entire war.
The Germans appeared to be on the point of breaking through and separating the French from the British armies. And this is one of the reasons why General Foch, the French commander, was appointed to be commander-in-chief of the Allies, because with one single commander-in-chief, he could order the British and the French to cooperate, and the Germans would not be able to divide and conquer by pushing the armies apart.
Ludendorff set his sights on Paris, now just 90 miles to the south. If the Germans captured it, victory would be theirs. On May the 26th, the German army renewed its offensive.
Fritz put down a barrage like nothing I'd heard before. His name for this type of artillery fire was Trommelfeuer, which means drum fire. And actually this was the best description. It was like a roll on a tremendous kettle drum.
In 4 days, the Germans advanced 30 miles and reached the River Marne. The French capital was in their sights. But now the fortunes would rapidly change. The first 2 months of the Ludendorff offensive had brought over 350,000 Allied casualties, killed, wounded, and taken prisoner. But the Germans themselves had suffered almost as many. Their lines were becoming stretched, but their commanders wanted one last push.
By July 1918, German High Command still had some degree of optimism, but they were uneasily aware that time had almost run out. They had attacked 4 times and failed to comprehensively defeat the British and the French. The Americans had arrived on the scene, and so they decided to go for one last offensive along the River Marne.
On July the 15th, 52 German divisions attacked. The French defences were set well back. When German storm troops arrived, they were out of range of their artillery support. Allied tanks and infantry counterattacked.
The Germans really had finally run out of steam. Their huge offensives had made a desperate attempt to finally bring the war to an early close. And in some ways they'd come quite near to doing that, but then gradually, by continually bashing away at different parts of the line, actually in the end they'd pretty much drawn their army to a standstill, and there was nothing more to give.
Ludendorff knew his gamble had failed.
Everything I had feared, and of which I had so often given warning, had here, in one place, become a reality. Our war machine was no longer efficient, even though the great majority of divisions still fought heroically.
By now, 1 million fresh American soldiers had arrived on the battlefield. The Allies could think of striking back. It was not just on the Western Front that the war was being turned on its head. In October 1917, an attack by the Germans and Austrians in northern Italy had driven the Italian army into headlong retreat. Finally, the Italians just managed to hold a line 15 miles north of Venice, while British and French troops were rushed in to help them. But in June 1918, after 6 months to regroup, the Italians were ready to counterattack. Their British allies were amazed by the turnaround in Italian morale.
The news is splendid. The Italians have completely re-established their line. So everyone is talking of the beginning of the end. The Austrians are in a rotten state, and there'll be trouble when the news of their defeat becomes known.
Then we all knew that Italy had been saved, and we rejoiced together. But we did not know that Austria-Hungary had no less surely been doomed, and must now disappear from the category of great powers.
But it was back on the Western Front that the war had to be finally won. And now the full panoply of Allied tactics, armor and manpower would combine to produce the greatest display of military force the world had ever seen. On the 4th of July 1918, an Australian division led a small-scale but pulverizing attack.
It was an absolute model of how battle should be fought. Infantry advancing behind tanks, being supported by masses of heavy guns, machine gun barrages from the machine gun corps, and with the Royal Air Force in close support, and actually dropping ammunition by parachute as well for the first time. The whole thing was a great success because of secrecy. The Germans had absolutely no idea that this was about to happen, and surprise was absolutely complete.
Learning from the Australian success, British and French commanders now planned a similar attack, but on the grand scale. Spearheaded by 530 British and 70 French tanks, the Allies concentrated a huge force near the town of Amiens.
On August the 8th, at 4 a.m., hidden in a mist which continued to shroud the preparations of the preceding night, our artillery opened an intense fire which demolished the enemy's batteries. The enemy, wholly surprised by the violence and rapidity of the attack, fell back in great confusion.
Then suddenly, with a mighty roar, more than 1,000 guns begin a symphony. Instantly, the whole complex organisation begins to move forward. Every man, every unit, every vehicle and every tank sweeping on, relentlessly and irresistibly.
We have advanced 10 kilometers. It's the beginning of a war of mobility.
For the Allies, it was the greatest day of the war so far. The attack was so quick and unexpected that one German brigade staff was captured while having breakfast.
Organization was perfect. As for advancing, the speed was terrific. It was glorious once again to be in the rush for an advance, so different from March, when we were the ones on the backward track.
The Allies advanced about 8 miles, and the Germans suffered casualties of the order of 27,000. Now this was a sort of victory which had not been seen on the Western Front since 1914.
Over the next month, the Allies pushed the Germans back 25 miles over a 40-mile front. Allied commanders were seeing an